Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm excited to be here today with Shane Heywood, who's an Umbrex member. He's an alum of Strategy and an independent consultant based in the UK. Shane, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot for having me, Will. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Shane, why don't you just give us a quick overview of your practice? I know that you do a lot of work around transformation, a lot of work around PMO and Gotomarket, but just give us a little bit of an overview on your practice.
So for the last 3 or so years, you're right, Will, I focus primarily on, two different areas, PMO and transformation. And then the second one would be Gotomarket. So in Gotomarket, I have focused on digital and physical goods, working with clients to help them come up with strategies as to how they can launch, drive, and really get the best out of the projects and initiatives that they're looking to lead.
That's fantastic. And you have an interesting background, right? So just tell us a little bit about where you grew up, and you've moved around a little bit.
Yes, I've had the chance to do that. So I was born in Jamaica, and then I moved to Canada at the age of 12. Lived there until coming to the UK around 11 years ago, originally for grad school, but then I ended up joining a management consultancy firm, Bain, and then have been living in the UK since then. With some of my clients, I've also had the chance to travel a lot for work, which has included Latin America, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia as well. So a variety of different experiences from different environments.
So you were mentioning another episode that we did on the show talking about diversity and inclusion. And I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective on this issue that's gotten so much more attention recently. Growing up in Jamaica, having time in Canada, in the UK, Sub-Saharan Africa, are clients asking about this issue? Have you been asked to work on it all? Curious, kind of your perspective on those that sort of, which has gotten so much more attention recently.
Absolutely. Look, no clients have asked me to work on it explicitly, but there has definitely been conversations around how to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workforce. So one client that I worked with was a large professional service firm, and post the George Floyd events, they were having an internal discussion around what they could do to improve and achieve their diversity and equity and inclusiveness goals. I guess just my personal perspective is that there are a lot of initiatives that do, not a lot, but there are a meaningful set of initiatives that do a pretty good job at bringing people from different backgrounds into corporate environments. I think that there are fewer initiatives that support promotion and retention of these diverse backgrounds. So a good example of that is within Canada and the US, there was a program called Inroads. And what Inroads does is that it helps talented visible minorities get access to internships and ideally full-time jobs at leading corporations like Procter & Gamble. So I was an Inroads intern. I did my internships at Procter & Gamble and then got a full-time hire. There were also similar programs in the US. Another one is called SEO, Special Education Opportunity. And in the UK, there's another program called RARE. And these all do the same things. They're getting youth that don't look like the typical face or of what a corporation might have used to look like, and getting them access to these jobs, getting them access to these opportunities, providing them with training and so forth. I guess where I see the biggest gap, even at my former client, is that the next steps aren't necessarily being taken. So by that, I mean initiatives around sponsorship and advocacy and mentorship. I can go into it a bit more details if you like, but I think ultimately it's fine to get people within the analyst pool. But if you want to talk about diversifying the partner pool and the managing director pool, it's what are you going to do to ensure that those who are in the building have an advocate when they're not in the room, in those crucial conversations where it's about the promotion? Or what are you going to do to ensure that they have the the kind of mentorship, the very practical mentorship that they need in order to succeed. So I guess I just kind of tie that up. I think there are a lot of good initiatives that have gotten even more attention since George Floyd. And the next kind of wave and the next opportunity that I see is driving retention through sponsorship and advocacy.
And so let's say you're advising a CEO on how to make that practical and real and implement that. What sorts of steps can an organization take to, to make that sponsorship happen?
I think to make that happen, you would need a program of sorts where your most talented leaders are willing to participate in it. They are recognized and valued for participating in it, and they are willing to collaborate or partner or support with anyone within the organization that has been identified as a potential beneficiary of this support. These kind of programs also work really well when there is some sort of structure, some sort of guidance, some sort of help to even start that initial conversation. Because you can imagine that, it's not unlikely that these two people might come from very different worlds. And so even that very first conversation, just having some guidance on, these are some common talking points, this is how you can understand how you could be of help. I think that kind of valued support, that kind of recognition is key towards helping those who need the guidance get the guidance.
At least at McKinsey, there's a there's a formal structure of this. McKinsey has what's called a DGL, or development group leader, and that's the partner or the associate partner that's assigned to look after your professional development, right? And that's the person who writes your semi-annual review, and it's sort of the formal system. And then, but the real kind of sponsorship tends to be a bit more informal. It tends to be, evolve out of a partner that you work with on a project, you get along with, and then that partner, has the sort of conversation with you after hours and so forth, and is the one who you give a call if you're thinking about what project should I take next and so forth. And so it tends to be a little bit more informal. Like, how can a company try, what steps can they take to encourage that informal sponsorship that's so critical? Because it seems like as soon as you start making it official and company like structured, it tends to get diluted a bit in terms of it's hard to kind of top down assign it, right? So how can you make it happen that there's more informal relationships?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, because when you have that formal connection, your best connections or your best information can often come from those informal networks. And that was my experience as well when I was at a management consultancy firm. I don't have a magic answer, but when I have seen that work well is when the culture kind of creates those opportunities for people to meet and to congregate in an environment where they might normally not do so. So whether it's your Friday beers, whether it's your quarterly meetings, whether it's your annual ski trips, it's how can you kind of create the opportunities where someone who is not necessarily in the same function, not necessarily in the same level, how can you create those opportunities for them to connect? And in the absence of that, I do think that having some sort of company structure might be the next best bet. So definitely you have your consensus reviewers and you have someone who is leading your consensus review on your behalf. But I'm also thinking of just something more voluntary in that respect. So whether it is a mentorship program, you have an advocate, you even have peer group members, it's getting support across the entire range or seniority at the company official or unofficial, but just I think until you can get the unofficial channels running more easily and without support, I think official channels of different seniorities outside of the census or the reviewing process, I think that might be the next best step.
Yeah. What do you think about for, a lot of listeners to the show, of course, are independent professionals. Do you have any thoughts around how independent professionals can, make sure that they're getting some mentorship or sponsorship or, connecting with people that have been around a little bit longer, to get those sorts of relationships?
I think that would definitely be something that is individually driven. So taking a look back at my career, I found that when I was thriving most was when I had access to not only mentorship, but also advocacy. And since working as an independent professional, the opportunities for professional development are definitely are 100% driven by me. And so with regards to sponsorship and advocacy, what I have sought to do is to say, okay, are there environments or networks where there are people who may have been doing this longer than I have, or who may have even more industry experience than I have, and how can I connect with them in a meaningful way to see if not only I can be of help, but if I can run a few things by them. So I attended one of Umbrex's workshops. I think it was last week or the week prior, decoding what the client wants. And in one of those breakouts, I ended up connecting with one of the individuals that was in there. Now, I'm not saying that, she's going to be my mentor, but I think that was a good opportunity in which I was really hopeful that I could connect with someone who might be willing to have a chat, and she was. So I guess to answer your question a bit more precisely, it's definitely going to be something that is self-driven, and it's going to be around finding where do these communities like Umbrex lie, where you can find someone that can be a sounding board.
Yeah. That sounding board is so important. For me, when I became an independent consultant, there were a couple people that helped me out a ton, and I'll name them. Rosina Samadani, who's a McKinsey alum who ran her own firm for a number of years, maybe 10 years. She's currently left independent consulting, and she's the CEO of Oculogica. And then Joaquin Fisher, who's still an independent consultant, does a lot of lean ops work. So I'd known both of them at McKinsey, and they were so helpful. I'd check in with them, every month or so, or anytime I had a project opportunity, I'd say, hey, what should how should I price this? Or how should I respond to this client request? Particularly during the, proposal phase. And they were so helpful to me. I think you can't.
100%. And then just to add to that, Will, your book, your Umbrex guide, that is, if that was ever to be printed, it's worth its weight in gold. Because the level of knowledge that is in that guide just helps anyone who wants to thrive as an independent professional do so extraordinarily well. So my commendations to you for creating that book.
Oh, well, that's very, very kind of you. And listeners, I think Shane's referring to on the Umbrex website, we have this guide with 90 videos on how to set up your own consulting practice. So if you haven't checked that out, and if you'd like access to it, let me know. So I think for anyone listening, you can't just ask someone, "Oh, would you be my mentor?" People look at you.
No.
So, but it's really, you need to just keep kind of going back to the person and asking, for advice on something specific, right? And that relationship can build up over time. And I would say that there are a couple people that do that with me on a regular basis, that will reach out to me, ask me for an advice. Maybe they'll show me a proposal and I'll give them some feedback on it. But far fewer people do it than I might have thought would. So it just requires taking a bit of initiative and reaching out to someone. And, I'm willing to do it, right? But very few people kind of take the initiative to ask. So I guess my message to everybody is, don't just like ask, oh, would you be my mentor and sign up for, advising me for free for, in a couple hours every month for the rest of your life, but just sort of take it one step at a time and, ask for something very discreet and specific. Hey, could you look at my website? Could you look at my LinkedIn? Could you look at this proposal? How should I price this project? Ask for something specific. And if the person responds, then, and also give them some feedback like, hey, thanks for your advice on that. I ended up getting the project, or I didn't get it, but thanks for your help anyway. And then, that can naturally develop. So I don't think that will necessarily solve the problem, but, more people should be, I think, encouraged to do that. So I know that this is not like the focus of your practice. So I appreciate you giving us your perspective and your suggestions on that, Shane.
No problem.
Let's talk a little bit about your work. So, you mentioned you do a lot of go-to-market work, right? So to talk, break down that term for me a bit. When we say a go-to-market project, that might mean different things to different people. Like, tell me what that includes in your world. If you hear go-to-market project, if you work on one, what are the different sort of pieces of that might be included in a go-to-market project?
You're definitely right in that it means many things to many people. For me, go-to-market is when you have done a strategy and you are now about to execute that strategy with a specific focus on a product, whether it is digital or whether it's a physical product. And as part of that go-to-market strategy, what you're really saying is, okay, we've identified what exactly does success mean for us, whether it's in terms of revenue or penetration. We've said these are the different markets that we're going to play in, whether that's from a consumer or a geographic perspective. We've said, these are the, for quote, end of quote, how we're going to win in terms of pricing or in terms of promotions. And then now it's a question of how do you put a plan in place to make sure that you deliver those results. So an example of this would have been, and this was prior to me working as an independent consultant, but it would have been when I was working with a consumer health company and we were launching 3 new brands in a new West African market. And so the question was, which partners or which retailers will we work with? What will our price point be like? What will our promotional calendar be like? And that's from the I guess the customer perspective, customer being the retailer, because that's the customer of the consumer health company. Then from a consumer perspective, you're really understanding what are the different preferences and how does that shape the different SKUs that you're going to launch. From a regulatory perspective, you're really saying, what can we bring into this country? What are the different laws? And then from an internal perspective, if you will, you're taking a look at your revenues, your budgets, and you're really saying, how am I going to achieve these goals? So it for me, when I hear go to market, it's very much representative of what those words say, taking a product and carrying it, going with it to the market.
Could you walk us through a case example?
I can do that. So there is a good example of this would be working in a sub-Saharan market with a, what is the best example? Yeah, sub-Saharan Africa market with 3 consumer health products. And so what we were looking to do was to enter a new country that the company did not have a presence in before. So the first part of creating that strategy, and this is a very common framework that you're going to hear across multiple people. I think you referred to it in A.G. Lafley's book. I've also seen something similar to it at Bain. But really you're saying, number one, what does success look like? And you can define that a variety of ways. But for us, it was really about hitting a revenue target and selling this product at a specific number of outlets. So the first step was to say, what does success look like for us? And the next thing that we did was to say, okay, in which markets do we want to play in? And by markets, we meant it in two dimensions. One was geographic. So within this country, which cities were we going to focus on? And then the second one was going to be in product segment. So yes, we're in consumer health, but which segments do we think are most relevant in this market, given what we have to offer? And then the third piece was then to say, okay, well, how exactly are we going to do this? So that would go around the promotion element, the pricing element, and also the distribution element. So which partners are we going to work with in terms of wholesalers? Are we going to work with distributors? What does the sales force at these wholesalers look like, etc.? So after we've said this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to do it, and this is where we're going to play. The most exciting part for me is then saying, okay, over the next 6 months, let's set different milestones. Let's across how many retailers we want to hit, how many distributors we want to collaborate with, what's our revenue going to be, and let's plot these out and work towards delivering each milestone. And this is where I find it really exciting, because you now have the strategy that you've created, then you're executing that strategy, and then you get to iterate. You're constantly seeing what's working, what's not working, and changing that plan as you go along. And so that was a good example where we were able to get, I can't remember the exact number, but a meaningful amount of market share within a very short period, where we had no limited presence before. And it was all around just taking that strategy straight through to execution. Was that helpful?
It was. Could you double click on the piece around, as a practical matter, how did you go about figuring out, the channels that you wanted to work through, like which specific distributors, which wholesalers, which retailers, for a country that you're not currently operating in? Did you kind of go on the ground and just, go, meet with people, or was it a survey, or, talk to other products, or how did you, what information did you have to gather? How did you go about doing it? How did you make that decision?
Great question. So I'll talk about how we did it, and then I can give a bit more detail on the information we had to gather. In terms of how we did it, it was through formal and informal channels. So, and the formal channel, you're doing desktop research just to see who are the major players there from a retailer perspective and a distributor perspective and wholesaler perspective. With these kind of markets though, and by these I mean emerging markets, things tend to be a bit less formal. So that's when you are on the ground, you're asking people who have either worked in the region or that country or a nearby country, who do they know that could possibly be of support? And by triangulating and because continuously asking, a few names will start to bubble to the surface. So it was a combination of both formal and informal channels, using the information that was already available to us while also seeking out new information. In terms of what kind of information we're looking for, it depends. And I guess I would think about how the information would vary for the retailer versus the partner that we were working with, the distributor or the wholesaler. And I guess to add more context, with this client or with this company that I was working with, they didn't always set up their own business within a new region. They would often find partners to work with, if only for the early stage of their relationship with that country. So the question that you're asking about the distributor or the wholesaler is, from a financial perspective, based on what you can understand, some of it's informal and once again, some of it informal. How are they doing financially? And then from outside of that, you want to understand what's their experience being a distributor. Have they worked with any other leading firms? Which retailers do they have a relationship with? What does their infrastructure looks like in terms of how many trucks they have, people on the ground, salespeople, etc. So it's really trying to understand, at a very high level, their financial and operational and commercial capabilities. And from a retailer perspective, there you're really trying to see for the segment that you were aiming at, where are you going to get that 80-20? So for example, if we're taking a look at modern trade, which would be the most sophisticated form of retailer that you could find within that region, you would want to know the 2 or 3 players who are going to deliver literally that 80% of that segment sales. And then if you're taking a look at the more traditional retailers, you're really trying to understand where do they come, who supports them, and where can I find them, and how can I support them in a very optimal way, which means that you're not going from stall to stall, but you're really also finding a good distributor or wholesaler who has a strong relationship with them. So I guess the information it's not dissimilar across the 2 different categories, whether it's retailers or the wholesalers, but equally, whether it's for the retailer or the wholesaler, you're really using informal and formal channels.
When you're entering a new country, how did you go about just initiating the discussion with, say, a retailer? In terms of finding the right person who's the merchandiser for that category and getting on that person's calendar and getting introduced. How do you actually practically go about doing that?
It really is having those kind of conversations to find out who would be the top 2 or 3 people that you'd want to be in touch with. And then also kind of creating an offer that would help to be of interest with them. So thankfully, the company that I was working with, they really had some very strong brands that were just very well known. And so when you walk in and you say, this is the company, some of them might not even know the company's name, but they know the brands. And so those brands really act as a very powerful way of getting that door to open. But even with those brands, it's not always enough, to be honest. I think you then need to have a conversation with them about what are they trying to achieve, and how can your brand help them do that, and what kind of support can you give them, whether it's marketing materials or whether it's marketing insight or sales insight or operational insight to help them grow. So it's the brands were very helpful in opening the door, but more importantly was what were you going to do, or what were you going to say to them once you sat down?
Let's talk a bit about some of the other type of work that you do. I think you do a lot of transformation and project management office type work. Can you, maybe pick a case example there and walk us through one of those types of projects you've done?
I can. I think one of the most exciting transformation cases that I've worked on was with a global food manufacturer that, after a integration of another company, they had tripled the number of number of employees that they had, and the number of markets that they were operating in. And I think the kind of biggest challenges there was, one, just the order of magnitude by which they grew meant that there were a lot of new processes that they need to put in place. In addition, they had truly internationalized the company, and so they had a wider scope in terms of geography that they needed to focus on. And the opportunity that I had to work with them was originally 10 weeks, but I ended up working with them for 15 months. And we were really able to, one, figure out what were some of the processes that we needed to put in place to make that happen. We were also able to figure out, for the different geographies, how could we share across the different geographies what they've learned. And I think the kind of big takeaway that I got from that opportunity was, as cheesy as it sounds, it's really truly one about people, and often being willing to kind of have the uncomfortable conversations earlier rather than later. And then I think the second piece is really about really being clear on what does winning look like, and constantly referring to that. So I think if I was to give you an example of those people and those tough conversations, it would be something along the lines of, for me, it was checking in with the senior leadership that I was working with and saying, over X amount of period, these are the results that we're seeing. Is this what you were expecting? Why or why not? What needs to be done differently? I think it's just really being proactive and solution oriented, as cheesy as that sounds, but just really being able to have those kind of conversations, knowing that they might not be easy, but ultimately you'll probably come out better on the other side.
And what were some of the processes that you're working to transform at that food manufacturer?
The processes were in terms of helping them get new IT infrastructure in place. So, when you're almost tripling or quadrupling the number of employees that you have, you almost want to you will need to create a different IT system and different approaches about how you operate your business. So it was really mapping and saying, this is how you operate now. This is where you want to operate in the future. How do you close that gap? Even internally within the PMO, we also had to be pretty clear about how are we going to operate as a PMO, because in an integration, things are moving so quickly that if there are not processes in place around how decisions will be made, that can be very difficult in terms of driving the results that you want to. So it was a lot in terms of supporting infrastructure, but also just PMO governance as well.
Yeah. Tell me about some of the tools that you use driving that project or other types of project management office type work. Are there any kind of technology tools that you use, Smart Sheets or just Google Sheets or Microsoft Project, or what do you use to sort of track all the different action items and where things are at?
They vary depending on the client and their openness to it. Like there's some clients where Microsoft Project works very well and they're very happy with that. There are some that they would want something from their view, something more accessible. So that could be something like Microsoft Excel, or I'm working from ThinkCell and I'm just updating Gantt charts. And then you have more sophisticated clients. And I don't really know this program that well, but I have used once or twice, I've worked with clients who also prefer a tool called Jira. But by and large, I think some combination of Microsoft Project, Excel, and ThinkCell will probably get you 80% of the clients that would be quite satisfied with that setup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know Jira as well either, but I know it's certainly one of the dominant ones in the whole kind of IT help desk tracking and being used along with ServiceNow for kind of tracking internal requests and so forth.
Yeah. Have you done you've done some PMO work, I think, Will, in the past, maybe?
Well, certainly, at Umbrex, we do PMO projects. I pretty much dialed back my own consulting practice to focus on leading Umbrex about 4 or 5 years ago. But we end up staffing a lot of people on PMO type efforts. And usually it will be like what you say, adopting whatever the client is already using. I did just do recently an episode with Andy C, who has, which it would be one to check out for listeners that are interested in different tools. He uses Smart Sheets and has really built a pretty cool system for tracking projects, and the client can get access to it. And it's a very powerful tool where you can, update one database, and clients can update it themselves directly with an interface, and then it updates all the charts and so forth to save a lot of time in kind of updating PowerPoint. So that seemed like a pretty good system for a large effort with multiple internal stakeholders.
Got it.
Yeah, I think that was episode 460, but yeah, the episode with Andrew C, SEAY. So yeah, what other tips do you have? You mentioned kind of governance. Talk to me about some of those questions that come up of governance of a PMO effort and some of the lessons learned around that.
I'm learning. Yeah, I think it comes as no surprise, but the most interesting elements of governance is around decision making, and whatever kind of framework you have. At Bain, what we had was called rapids. Whatever framework you have, the earlier that you can get the answer on that, the quicker that, the more likely that project is to be successful, I think, and the easier it will be for everyone. So for example, when I was working with a client that was a social impact organization, and they had acquired, if you will, another social impact organization that had operations in sub-Saharan Africa, the final phase of the integration, the question was around who would be responsible for creating strategies that took the broad global strategy and then implemented it at the local country level. And within Bain, they have something that's called D, for who holds the D, or the decision making, versus P, who will perform the decision and do the work. And throughout the entire integration, which was, I don't know, let's say over 10 months, no one had really answered that question. And so when I had the opportunity to join them, that was one of the key questions that we really focused on answering as quickly as possible. It's who's going to make the decision on what needs to happen, and then who is actually going to execute it or perform the decision. And I had the opportunity to perform the decision, which meant, going into Excel, and also meant that we had the chance to travel to these different countries, which was a really cool experience. But I think just more importantly, it's not rocket science, but something happens when the strategy leaves the strategy PowerPoint isn't enough anymore, and people are actually doing the work. Sometimes we forget, more often than not, actually, we forget what we should be doing, and we do something else. And so I think governance, specifically around decision making and ownership, that's one area that I've always seen had a powerful impact on the success of a project.
Yeah, absolutely. Shane, if listeners wanted to follow up with you and learn more about your practice or reach out, where would you point them online?
They could reach out to me on LinkedIn. They could search my name, Shane, H-E for Echo, Y for Yankee, Wood. Or they could try my company's page, which is Portland, so Portland, Portland Ventures, Inc. And on either platform, they can definitely get a hold of me.
Fantastic. Well, we will include those links in the show notes. Shane, thanks for joining us today, sharing your perspective on some, go-to-market, transformation, PMO, and kind of diversity inclusion. It's been a real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Will. I really appreciate it. And once again, keep up the great work with Umbrex.
Thank you.